Hi, everyone. This is episode 4 in our book review series on the book entitled Paul on Trial, The Book of Acts as a Defense of Christianity by John Mauck. It's published in 2001. And the intro line at the top there says, "A veteran lawyer presents a new key to unlocking the book of Acts." And that's exactly what it was. Now, it isn't exactly a new key because I'm going to show you it was last advanced in 1720. I found that in my research. But that research was dug out after he wrote this book recently in 2001. Another author is going to reveal that to us. And so we now know what that other source material is. We have to dig that source up, and it doesn't show up on Google readily. So we're going to keep digging to get that eventually. But anyway, the point of this short video is that Mr. Mauck did not know about this, so he deserves a huge amount of kudos and great blessings from the Lord, because this truth is a truth that lets us re-look at the book of Acts as not endorsing Paul, but instead defending the church and Paul simultaneously, and willing to show things to the pagans that they would like, that Christians would be revulsed about when we meditate carefully and consider them. All right. So putting two and two together, what appears to have happened here is that the first person to come up with this idea was Mr. Human in 1720. And I only mean came up with the idea in the post early Christian period. So in the early Christian period, they know and record this history according to Mr. Human. And he's digging that all up in his article. And we need to get that article to get the actual detail. And then Joshua Yoder is confirming that's what Human's article does. It brings up the traditional view of the early church that Theophilus was a pagan magistrate to whom Luke addressed his book as an apologia. So that's how the early church understood it. That's what Mr. Yoder recorded. And that part of the story needs to be resurrected. And it may require getting this article by Mr. Human in Latin and then translating it, or most of it, to get the new information that might be there. So there's more to dig into this, because Mr. Mauck didn't even know this was a line of interest. He just simply found the same conclusion without looking at any of that actual evidence from the early church. He just used common sense by figuring out legal proceedings, because as a lawyer, he knows, the way you address a person can indicate in that era and time the title and the office of that person. He's a magistrate, your most excellent magistrate. So these are common things that could be deduced. And then he figured it all out and then put it all in context and did a great job. And okay, so I'm going to stop for a minute and we'll be right back. Okay, next we're going to talk about what is the impact of Mr. Mauck's work on Christianity. Can it actually change the focus of Christianity from Paul to Christ? Because we are suffering in a dispensational nightmare, frankly, that Mr. Mauck did not realize is partially contributed to by a misconception about the book of Acts. Mr. Mauck did not apparently realize the consequence of what he was exposing to us. And that makes his truth even better, meaning he is not aware that the book of Acts is used by people to say, hey, this shows that Paul is a legitimate figure. It praises him, it extols him, it makes him look like the most important person of Christianity. Well, of course, in a trial brief, an appellate brief, the person at issue has to become the focus of your appellate brief. But it did not mean that Paul had that same importance outside of that appellate brief process. And that's the key to this whole thing, that Mr. Mauck, I don't think, anticipated would support a different perception of Christianity from this day forward, from the day he wrote his book. Once it was absorbed, we would then have a freedom now to go back to Christ, which is, he should be thankful to what he did. God used him in a way that he can never, God will reward him, even though he did not intend what the consequences will be. And what I'm being very clear, I want to be absolutely clear. The consequences are, we will no longer look at the book of Acts as something that is endorsing Paul. Not at all. It is defending him from an appeal. And that is a quite different thing. And I'm going to now go into a discussion. I recorded this earlier, so I'm going to put it in here at this point, and you'll see how I outline this point. And then I just want to say, hey, Mr. Mauck's book, once properly absorbed and properly advanced by people who've read the book, knowledgeable about the book, or at least have gotten enough of exposure to the book through my videos or some other summary, you could help advance Christianity to get back to Christ. Because now we're no longer bound to accept Paul as an apostle. We're only bound to understand the book of Acts was to defend Paul from a trial that he led a riot. He caused a riot at the temple, and it was due to his friend Trophimus entering the temple uncircumcised. And that was putting Christianity in the block, because that looked like one of the people who were closely involved in it, Paul, was leading Gentiles to violate the sanctity of the temple and create conflict with the Jewish people. We would lose our ability to claim we are entitled to a license to operate as a religion if we can't operate under Judaism, because now we have offended them, unmistakably, and the Romans will take the side of the Jews against the Christians. Okay, what ends up happening here is Paul is acquitted. So we know that the tactics and the strategy of Luke worked, and here's the keys to his victory. As a lawyer, I can tell you these are how he won, if you just pay attention. He did three things that are unequivocally the key to the victory. One, the most important thing, is he brought out the fact that the Python priestess, a pagan woman, who's basically an oracle for Apollo, the sun, but she is literally under the control of demons, and she goes into trances and writhes and gobbledygook. She speaks glossalia herself. It's a well-known fact of history. This was an institution in the Greek pagan religions, all the way from 600 BC all the way into actually literally Constantine revived it at Constantinople in the 325 era, and but she was still operating at the time of Paul, and her message, and another thing, they're all anonymous, nobody knows their actual names, but it was an office, a paid office of government. She got salaried, and she rotated the job with two other women. So there are three women who would do that at Delphi. There was a woman at Philippi who would do the same thing. And this woman was known as whatever she said, if she endorsed an emperor, that emperor would win. If she endorsed a war and a battle, or going in a certain country and invading it, people would do whatever she said. Now, of course, I'm skeptical, right? But could she have been influenced with a demon and do that? Well, a priest would translate her glossalia into a written summary and give it to a customer who was paying. So people would pay for her prophecies. Then these people could take these prophecies back to the general and say, this is what the Delphic Oracle says. It's a well-known fact that in the early 300s, the Roman generals, the Roman emperors, the Roman consul would actually pay messengers to go to the Delphic Oracle and get her direction. Should we attack here? Should we not attack here? And things like that. Crazy stuff. I think it's Diocletian who did that. So she is crucial. And so if this woman, who is a priestess for Apollo, which means the god of the sun, and if you're Nero and you are a pagan and you believe in the god of the sun, you believe in Apollo, because that's Greek and Roman religion matched there, even before Sol Invictus showed up, you would then take whatever she says. Roman emperors acknowledged and obeyed this oracle for centuries. If you heard what Luke records, the Python priestess for many days endorses Paul's way of salvation, not Jesus Christ, not anything but Paul's teaching of the way of salvation, you would conclude unequivocally, this is not somebody we want to touch. We want to let him go back and teach his way of salvation. That means it wasn't surprising that Nero would acquit. This is never mentioned by Mr. Mauck. He doesn't seem to know. He misunderstood because of some mistranslations that never used the word Python. And so he did not understand who she was, and he thought she was some sort of slave girl. He missed the greatest proof that what he was saying was true. The second thing, and he doesn't emphasize this either, is Dionysius is speaking through Jesus from a Euripides play. So when Jesus says you can't kick against the pricks, the actual words of the original play are in meter, and to make it work in meter, you have to use a plural of the word kicks. Otherwise, you wouldn't say that normally. You kick against the prick. This was the exact meter from the play of Euripides, where Dionysius, who is what? A son of God, who leaves the Mount Olympus to come down from the clouds, basically, to live with humans, and he's divested. He was emptied of all that made him God, and now he was living as a human being, and he could be hurt and harmed. And he ends up being killed and his guts eaten by animals, but he's allowed to resurrect, and that would be the exact story. You could picture, if you could tell this story to pagans and make them think that Jesus Christ quotes from this play, obviously to make a connection between himself and Dionysius, which is how Paul is recounting this story to Luke and to us and to the pagan. There's three accounts of the Damascus Road experience in Acts 9, 22, and 26. All three slightly different. Some are significantly different. But in two of the three, this is what Jesus says. One time this is repeated in court. One time this is just in Luke's summary for us in Acts 9. So we know that this would then totally impress pagans. This play of Euripides in Greek was read and understood and used in Roman culture as well as in Greek culture. This is like a TV show to them. Like, basically, they don't have TV. So what do they spend their time on? They can only get entertainment through plays. So this Euripides play was one of the most popular for centuries. For centuries. Every Roman general, every Roman emperor would probably have heard this play multiple times. And these words are coming out of the words of Jesus, supposedly Jesus, in this middle of the book of Acts twice. And we Christians are never told this, and we can't recognize this is a big deal. But they recognize it's from the play because it's meter, not only the words, but the words are in meter. And that is a second reason why Nero's going, oh, well, this is a very sophisticated man, Mr. Jesus, and he knows what he is. He knows he's this god like Dionysius who comes from the heavens down to earth. Maybe he is Dionysius. Maybe that's what if I were Nero, that's what I would conclude. And hey, I'm not going to mess with Dionysius. So first of all, I find out the Python priestess thinks he's basically Paul has the way of salvation. That's strike in favor of quitting. Two, Dionysius is being quoted by Jesus. This guy, I don't even know who he is, but hey, man, he's hip because he's quoting a line from my favorite play. Now, the last one, which is the best one, or the most conclusive one, is the Mars Hill speech, where Paul clearly is contradicting the Bible. This is Luke 17, verse 24. He says he's talking to the pagans at the court of Areopagus in Athens, and he's having a debate with them. That's what people think, but it's actually his court testimony. They want to find out what's going on too and hear what's going on, because this is they were having a controversy with him. The events did not yet happen in with the temple, so this was another kind of court. Areopagus is the head of a court, so some other court issues going on. So he's probably under oath saying this, and he says at one point the God, the creator of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made of human hands. Well, we all know, all Christians, had we reflected upon this and thought Luke is trying to appeal to pagans, we would have been more open to understand and listen carefully. Okay, yeah, I know technically God does dwell in temples made of human hands. And he right at the moment Paul's speaking these words, God the Father, Yahweh, is dwelling at the temple of Jerusalem. And in fact, hadn't dwelled in over 2 millennium, except for a couple of events where he was once in a mobile tent, and then later it was moved to a temple, and that temple was destroyed, the first temple, and now we're in the second temple period, and that hasn't been destroyed yet, and that's in the future. So at this point in time, we have anyone who's a Christian listening knows that what Paul said is biblically false, or Paul would have to be an enormous ignoramus. And it's hard to believe a guy who had been a, quote, Pharisee and had been trained under Gamaliel would not know that God dwells at the temple made of human hands. So, but in Roman and Greek religion, the gods do not live in temples made of human hands. They dwell at Mount Olympus. kind of outdoor gods. They can live outside because they don't need clothes like you and I. They're gods. They don't feel pain and cold and heat and all that. So they can wear as much clothes or as little clothes as they want, and they're usually depicted with no clothes. Just so you know, the statues are all naked usually. So their gods are not like humans that they would dwell in a building. They dwell outside, but when there is a sacrifice, they'll come visit at the time of sacrifice. But otherwise, they depart. There's no burning light to indicate that they're dwelling in a temple anywhere. So that appeals directly to Nero. But what's more significant and what's the key to this whole case is the charge Paul is facing and pending before Nero. And I'm going to take a break. I'm going to come right back and we'll tell you what that is. Okay, so what were the charges against Paul at the time that he was with Nero? Well, basically, the charges affected the involvement of his friend Trophimus. And the Jews accused Paul of being responsible for Paul bringing the friend Trophimus an Ephesian with him into the temple area that was the sacred area. And here's how the NIV records it. They, the Jews in the temple who went into a riot, had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city and with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple area, meaning the sacred area. And that's what Luke is saying. So did Trophimus just happen to be at the temple area that day and was not brought there by Paul into the temple area? That's true. That is true. Luke doesn't ever admit that Paul brought Trophimus, his friend, into the temple area, which was sacred. Okay, so that is evidence. There's a lack of evidence that Paul brought him all the way into this sacred temple area. Paul, when he is confronted with his friend having done that and a riot breaks out, he says to them, Luke says that the Jews suppose Paul had done so, meaning brought Trophimus into the prohibited area. Well, let me go back here. Neither Luke nor Paul ever denied Trophimus defile the temple. Instead, both Luke and Paul merely tried to deny there was proof that Paul had brought Trophimus into the prohibited area. So there's a prohibited area beyond the middle wall separation. Luke says the Jews supposed Paul had done so, like literally walked him through the under the arch that had signs prohibiting you entering if you were uncircumcised. Luke says the Jews supposed Paul had done so because they had earlier saw Paul together with Trophimus in Jerusalem. Acts 21, 28, 29. Trophimus was indeed a close companion of Paul. He's mentioned in Acts 20, verse 4 in that capacity, as well as in 2 Timothy 4:20. So there's no dispute that Paul knew him beforehand, and what Luke is leaving it up to the Romans to conclude or assume that it's just a coincidence that Trophimus from Ephesus is there at the temple at the same time Paul is. And Paul, when he's confronted, was quick to say that he was in a ceremonial bath at the time. All right. Paul said his accusers merely found him, Paul, purifying himself in the temple. This is in Acts 24:18. This was the only inadequacy Paul cited to the charge that he, Paul, was responsible for Trophimus' profaning the temple. And that charge is at Acts 21, verse 28. The Jewish rioters claim Paul, quote, brought Greeks also into the temple and defiled this holy place. So what they were claiming is Paul had literally walked Trophimus into the temple and then let him go. That's their view. And that person whom he let go and didn't stay with ended up defiling the holy place. That's their view. What Luke said is they assumed, since they had seen Paul with Trophimus earlier in town, that based on that, they concluded that Paul had brought Trophimus all the way into the temple area, the sacred area. So you can just see it's inconclusive whether Paul ever brought Trophimus into the temple physically or brought him all the way into the temple area that was beyond the middle wall of separation, basically walked him right through the wall. And that is where that evidence was left, meaning it's inconclusive. It's an assumption. It's a supposition. So that may be material in whether Paul is guilty or not. So nobody was coming forth as a witness that they'd seen Paul walk him into the temple in the first place or walk them past the middle wall of separation. So there's missing pieces of evidence in the way Luke is saying nobody proved that Paul had brought him in the temple area, the sacred part of the temple. So that, for Luke's viewpoint, that's what matters. For what is the other issue possibly raised by Luke is that did Paul even bring him into the temple? Because that was what the basis of the supposition of the Jewish writers was, that Paul had brought him into the temple. And is that enough to prove Paul's guilt? So does a Jewish person who brings a Gentile friend into the temple, does he have a duty to stay with that person so he doesn't wander away and walk into the sacred, into the arch of the middle wall separation and make this defilement of the temple? And it's a big deal. The defiling of the temple carried a death sentence. I mean, this is just big stuff. So anyway, so I think now we can understand why Paul's statement that Nero is going to read in this brief, or the magistrate Theophilus is going to read and then brief Nero on, is crucial. God does not dwell in temples made of human hands. Acts 17, verse 24. Paul speaking in another court setting with the Areopagus, the head of the court of Athens, saying that God does not live in a temple made of human hands. Therefore, a Roman reading that and applying it to this case would say the Jewish people, some of them, have a myth that God actually dwells there. I have an authority of this Pharisee who are respected by the Romans. They are subservient to the Romans, and they will back us up, therefore, that this was not an event that would have defiled anything because God doesn't actually live there. And that would be undisputed testimony and evidence at this hearing, because nobody likely came all the way from Jerusalem to help keep this appeal going. But the magistrate is doing an investigation ahead of time, assuming it'll be vigorously contested, and maybe it was. We don't know. There's no evidence about who contested it. So maybe it came in uncontested or not, but the Roman magistrate would conclude, well, there's no basis to be concerned about a temple that God doesn't dwell in anyway, if somebody comes in uncircumcised or not. And certainly a uncircumcised Gentile as Theophilus and as Nero would almost laugh at the whole idea that God cares whether you're circumcised or not, right? So this just gave them the license to not find Paul guilty and to actually, basically, in their own minds, ridicule the writers for believing there was any such concern at all about what Trophimus did. And so ultimately, that could be the number one reason why they dismissed the charges. That the appeal was Paul was acquitted of all wrongdoing in this, according to Eusebius. That's the way he put it, and Jerome concurs. So yes, so if we go back now, I want to show you again the three new issues that he did not see, that Mr. Mauck did not see, that I think are conclusive. So these are the 3 points that were not mentioned by Mr. Mauck, or at least not the way I'm saying they would have had an influence on a pagan court. The Python priestess, the oracle of the ancient world, of the pagan world, she endorsed his way of salvation for many days, and Paul did nothing. Finally, after many days, he cast out the demon from her. Obviously, maybe he was afraid people would think demons are endorsing him, and he didn't want that. Then there's the quote of Dionysius from the Mount of Jesus, of a Euripides play, making it look like Jesus is trying to directly claim he's Dionysius, because it's an uncanny, identical similarity. A son of God who comes to earth, empties himself of godhood, is killed, died, and then resurrects from the dead. I mean, clearly that would be the whole reason for the words coming out of Dionysius to be repeated by Luke, so that the appeal would be won, because now this is a character very sympathetic to the Roman and Greek world. It was a dying god that a lot of people felt sorry for. And the story is meant to make you empathize with Dionysius. And finally, there's the Mars Hill speech, where Paul says God does not live in temples made of human hands. And that's the very core issue of the legal dispute. Was there a serious charge here? Was Trophimus's act really that all that bad? Is it a big deal? Should we go after this Roman citizen? Paul's a Roman citizen. Just because some guy walks into an area of a temple that other people claim is sacred and God dwells there, when this guy, Paul, assures the evidence we've been presented through this brief is Paul says in court and before the Areopagus that God does not dwell in temples made of human hands. And he claims he was a student of Gamaliel. It says that right in the book of Acts. And he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. It also says that in the book of Acts. And so we the magistrate would say we should conclude, he would tell Nero, we should conclude that there must just be a Jewish myth that God dwells at that temple. He doesn't really dwell there. Which, by the way, this whole thing could have led the Romans to conclude, you know what, we can now seize the temple in 70 AD. This is only about 10 years later. So they're going to go attack the temple. Well, why did they feel unafraid of God being there? Okay, well, God wanted them to do that. They didn't know that. Trophimus' act of defiling the temple, God says, anyone who abominates the temple by entering it in an uncircumcised state, I will destroy my temple. So it only took 10 years for God to do it. But maybe the Romans took courage to do that from the very words of Paul being read by Luke, recording his words at the Mars Hill speech. He literally said it's nothing. It's just a myth. He doesn't even dwell there. So the Romans' fear of other religions and other gods, just so you know, is real. They really believe, Yahweh was likely another god. They had a fear. But if Paul's assuring them he's a Roman citizen, he's laughing. Paul is laughing it off. You think God lives in a temple made of human hands? Forget it. He doesn't live there. So the Romans are going, next time we're in a war with them, we're going in on their temple. We're going to take the whole thing down. And in this instance, 1 million people were killed who were huddling inside the Temple Mount and the temple physical building itself to protect themselves. And after 9 months of siege, 1 million people were killed. In that era, that's like killing 30 million people. So anyway, that's just another thing. But Paul may have a lot more to explain to God than just simply his doctrines, his leading people away from Christ, his boasting. All these other things may be minor compared to the million deaths that may be responsible that he gave Rome the permission to take down that temple because it's just a building. It doesn't mean anything. And the Romans are good about taking down buildings. They just have to siege it long enough and they can tear down every piece of stone to the ground. Okay, everybody. So I hope that helps us understand the position of Mr. Mauck in history. His book will be remembered forever because it broke a deadlock. It revived something that had been dead for 280 or 90 and 280 years when he wrote it, which was a very important resurrection, if you will, of the evidence at that time that this book of Acts, was not written to defend. It was not to extol Paul, but to defend him from the charges, and was willing to actually allow words from Paul that are anti-biblical. In the Mars Hill speech, those are anti-biblical words. He was willing to put it in there, knowing that Christians would be offended by it, wouldn't believe, could not accept someone who would be such a biblical ignoramus that God does not dwell in temples of human hands, and who also was endorsed by a Python priestess. The Python priestess for many days was endorsing Paul's way of salvation. She was not endorsing Jesus. He did nothing for many days. So again, was not intended for Christians to think that was a good fact, that Paul accepted this for many days and took advantage of it, particularly those who are Gentiles who would know the word Python had a trigger for them that this is somebody that's influential. So Christians who were in the pagan world but had repented and come over to follow Christ would have been offended, thinking that this influential figure thinks Paul has a way of salvation. She's going to only endorse demonically controlled people herself. And anyway, so that's the lesson for today. That basically Mr. Mauck's book will change history, and the evidence is only to get stronger. I found 3 pieces of evidence in the book. There's many more, I'm sure. The book of Acts, many more that can be argued that they would offend Christians if we thought more deeply about it, like these 3. Okay, everybody, take care. God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.